fired up to welcome in one of the premier voices in all of sports. And when I think of my childhood, Jordan's last shot, Yankee World Championships, NBA Finals, the Olympics, the World Series. Yeah, I think of Derek Jeter and Michael Jordan, but I also think of this guy. The great Bob Costas from the MLB Network is nice enough to join us. Bob, John Jastrzemski, appreciate a couple minutes. How are you, good sir?
Hi, John. How are you doing?
Bob, I'm doing fine. And first things first, I feel like I'm asking anybody who comes on the show during this pandemic, like the same opening questions. So it's like in many ways, I'm doing the Tonight Show in many ways. But, I'll ask you this to start it off. During this time in which, we haven't had live games, for many of us, have been stuck at home, what has been the element for you that has kind of kept you going to some degree? Is there one specific thing, Bob?
No, not one specific thing, but you take the long view. There's nothing we can do about the circumstances where we have to self-isolate. Maybe that's opening up a little bit, but only very, very cautiously. We don't know for sure yet where it's all going, so we all just have to bide our time until the circumstance achieves some clarity. And as far as sports is concerned, again, I keep track of what seems to be happening. I read everything I can about where the negotiations are or what the NBA or the NFL's plans are going forward. But there's nothing we can do in terms of covering these things until there's something to cover. So what it has provided me, and I'm sure this is true of others, is even as I try to keep up with these things, I don't have as much to prepare for as I used to because there are no games or broadcasts to speak of to prepare for. So it allows me to read more outside sports, which I've always liked to do. It allows me to go back and catch up with all the stuff on Netflix or all the old movies that I've had the DVDs sitting in the cupboard somewhere and I haven't gotten around to. So I think I've been able to make the most of these past few months.
Well, Bob, you were prominently featured a couple weeks back as we're reliving the 90s Jordan Bulls and that Last Dance documentary, I think, that captivated everybody's imagination.
Yeah.
And for a guy like you, I mean, you're in the studio for all those years, and then you're doing play-by-play, Jordan's final season, and, you've been a part of so many iconic moments with all your years on the mic being a sports broadcaster. Mm-hmm. When you think about games you were a part of, special moments you were a part of, Jordan's last shot and hitting that game winner over Byron Russell's got to be near the top of the list, right?
Yeah, it's very, very high on the list. I didn't do the play-by-play of Kirk Gibson's dramatic home run off Dennis Eckersley in Game 1 of the '88 World Series. Vin Scully and Joe Garagiola were in the booth, but I was the pregame and postgame host. So even being a small part of that broadcast, that was so dramatic and so theatrical. That ranks up there. Muhammad Ali lighting the torch at the Olympics in '96 at the opening ceremony ranks up there. The exploits of Michael Phelps and Jackie Joyner-Kersee, Usain Bolt, Simone Biles, the Dream Team, all those Olympic memories are up there. And then very, very high on the list, as you mentioned, John, is that whole season for the Chicago Bulls and the way it ended on that last perfect shot. If you were making a movie, I don't know how you could script it any better or have it play out any better for dramatic purposes.
Bob, did you get the sense that team was vulnerable throughout that year, or because it was Michael Jordan, because it was the Chicago Bulls, you kind of thought deep down they'd find a way because they're too damn good?
Well, I thought they might find a way, but yes. It's a good question, John, and the answer is yes. I thought they were vulnerable. The Pacers almost got them in the Eastern Conference Final. They pushed them to 7. The home team won every game, but in Game 7, the Pacers were up 19-7 in the first quarter, up 12 at a time when games weren't 120 to 115. They were often 85-82 or something like that. So just mathematically, that 12-point difference loomed bigger in that context. And then the Jazz, who had a crack at them the year before when they lost in 6, they could have left Utah to come to Chicago up 2-0. The Bulls got out of there with a split. There was an overtime game mixed in there. So it could have been 2-0 Jazz. And obviously the Jazz could have pushed it to a 7th game. They had the 1-point lead until Jordan made the shot in Game 6. And even Stockton's last chance shot nearly went down. It was on target and just a little bit long. Otherwise, there is a Game 7 at the Delta Center with Scottie Pippen hobbling. So, yeah, I thought the Bulls were very, very vulnerable. And so when people say we wish they had come back, the way it was broken up was ridiculous, of course, with Jerry Krause deciding that he's going to break it up and rebuild it. Yeah, right. Okay. Krause was a very good general manager, but he overshot in that particular case. But I understand why people wanted to see them come back, wanted to see it sustain as long as possible. But part of the answer to your question, John, is the next year, if they had run into David Robinson and Tim Duncan in the finals since the Spurs came out of the West, or the year after that, Shaq and Kobe with the Lakers coming out of the West, I don't know that they could have gotten a seventh, and I certainly don't think they would have gotten an eighth.
Bob, I watched an interview you did a couple of weeks ago with Scott Van Pelt, and you brought up such a great point. And I remember watching these games, reliving these games, but the feud between Isaiah Thomas and Michael Jordan is obviously something that was brought up quite a bit, the Dream Team, then in this documentary. But as you're doing games for NBC at the time, you have Doug Collins and Isaiah Thomas next to you. And I thought you brought up a great point. You said Isaiah, in no way, shape, or form, held that grudge towards Michael in doing games. It was not something that he was belly aching about all the time. And I'm curious, Bob, was that something when you found out Isaiah was coming to NBC and was going to be doing games with you and, you know, Michael Jordan, the Chicago Bulls are the toast of the NBA, was that something that at first you felt, oh, is this going to be awkward? Is this going to be uncomfortable? Or were you guys able to basically dive in right away, all systems go?
It crossed my mind. Because I had been with NBC, and the NBA was on NBC in the early 90s when this all played out, and the Olympics in 92 was in Barcelona was obviously on NBC, and I was the host of the Olympics. So we had covered that whole thing before the Olympics began. Why wasn't Isaiah on the team? So I knew that it was a factor, and we talked about it a little bit initially. And Isaiah, and as I said to Scott Van Pelt, it wasn't just that he never took any backhanded shots or withheld any credit from Michael on the air. He proclaimed him the best player he had ever played against, and he gave him more than ample praise throughout that postseason. But even out to dinner, walking around, in production meetings, I never heard him once gripe about Michael Jordan or take a shot at him. The real issue for us, just from a broadcasting standpoint, was I was really a big basketball guy. I'd started out in the ABA. I'd done college games, NBA games earlier in my career, but I hadn't done play-by-play, at least not much to speak of, a game here or there. I hadn't done play-by-play in quite a long time, so I was a little bit rusty. And Isaiah had never done it at all. So he was entirely a rookie, and I was trying to get the rust off. So the first 9-10 games probably could have been better. But after that, and after Doug Collins joined us to make it a threesome, then I think we really hit our stride, luckily in time for the playoffs, because those were epic playoff games.
The legend, Bob Costas, now the MLB Network. He joins us here on The Fan. And Bob, selfishly, as a guy who grew up with you doing all those Yankee playoff games in the late 90s, doing the World Series, it is so great that you're back announcing Major League Baseball games. And I remember I ran into you a couple of years ago and I was doing one of the shows out at Citi Field, and I mentioned this to you. It's great. Like, do you enjoy the idea? And I know obviously you're not doing it right now, but like throughout the year, I flip on a random game on the MLB Network. It's Costas and Cott. It's Costas and Smoltz. It brings me back to my childhood, Bob. I love it, man.
Thank you. You know, it doesn't seem that long ago, at least to me, when Young and Irreverent were attached to my name. Young, irreverent Bob Costas. Fresh-faced newcomer Bob Costas. The new kid on the block. But now, I can't deny it, it's what the calendar says. Yeah, a lot of people, not just kids in college or whatever, but 40, 45-year-old people can say, I grew up listening to you. I guess that's true, because I started at NBC when I was in my late 20s. I was there for 40 years. And now continuing to do games on the baseball network. So I guess for some people, it's not just tonight's game. It's like when they listen to anybody who's been around for a while. It isn't just about tonight's game. It takes them back to the games they'd watched and listened to earlier in their life. And when you hear people say that with some appreciation, it makes you feel good, that in some small way you were part of their experience.
Bob, being around Jordan's Bulls, being around the Yankees in the 90s, did you see similarities between the two and all their dominance?
Well, baseball's a little bit different than football or basketball or hockey. The dominance can show on the scoreboard. You don't feel it as much from a physical standpoint, if you know what I mean, John, where you feel a team imposing its will physically on another team. But the Yankees of the late 90s and early 2000s really were relentless. And I remember talking about this on some of these postseason games. You gave them the slightest opening. It didn't even have to be an error. A double play not turned. You give them a fourth out in an inning. It seemed like they were always so opportunistic. They always jumped on it. They seldom made mistakes. And unlike some previous Yankee teams, and, teams that aren't just dominant in an era, but a team like the Yankees that have been dominant for decades and decades, they're going to have people who love them, and then they're going to have people who resent them. But that Yankee team really was hard to dislike because of Joe Torre and because of the core four. How are you going to dislike, really, Derek Jeter? How are you going to dislike Mariano Rivera or Bernie Williams or Jorge Posada, and especially Torre as kind of the face of the team, Torre and Jeter. And since they were winning all the time, George Steinbrenner, with whom I always got along very well personally, he was always great to me, and I think he's a very significant figure in the history of baseball and more positive than negative, but we know how tempestuous Mr. Steinbrenner could be. But since they were winning all the time, he was more or less held in check. So that kind of bellicose presence was muted. And the image of the team was the image of the people I've just mentioned. And then when 9/11 happened and much of the nation rallied around New York and the Yankees got all the way to the seventh game of the World Series, carrying some of the spirit of that post-9/11 New York City, and people kind of attaching themselves to the Yankees as some way of returning to normal and lifting their spirits, then it became very, very hard, even for self-proclaimed Yankee haters, to dislike the Yanks.
Bob, full disclosure, last Friday night I'm doing a show, and I'm flipping through, trying to find something to watch. And I've rewatched all these 90 games, countless times. But Game 5 of the 96 ALCS, I had never seen the rewatch of that before. So I was captivated. It's you, it's Joe Morgan, it's Bob Uecker. It's all this great talent on the field. And it's kind of crazy in a way. The last out of that game, and I'm sure you remember it, it's a ground out to Derek Jeter, and it's Cal Ripken, who is the dominant shortstop of the era, diving in head first. They just get him. Torrey's hysterically crying in the dugout. And listen, that's one of the memorable calls you have of doing those Yankee playoff games back then. Is there one that you think of, all these years later, that maybe stands out above the rest?
Well, that was one of them. And I'm like you, John. I hadn't seen these games. And sometimes I don't even know.
Well, you're Bob Costas. You don't need to. That's what it comes down to. You don't got to critique. Come on now, Bob. We know that.
Fun. 24 years later, and I had not seen the game that you're talking about. I'd seen highlights of it and little clips of the play-by-play, but I hadn't seen it from start to finish. And sometimes I just come across them. Sometimes somebody at MLBN will tip me off that it's going to be on, so I know. But other times I just channel surfing and, whoa, now it's the fourth or fifth inning. Hey, isn't that me? Yeah, that is me. And what you mentioned, I think we hit on it at that moment, that there was something symbolic about it. Cal Ripken, who the year before had surpassed Gehrig and still had a few more years to play, but he's now a senior figure in the league. And he makes a headlong dive into first base, a desperate dive, but Jeter, the rookie of the year in 96, throws him out from deep short. So there was some symbolism in that. And, sportscasting isn't brain surgery, but I've always prided myself on not just being able to call the plays, but maybe seeing what the storylines were and maybe hitting on some of the things that a well-written story the next day or the next week in a magazine would mention. So that would have been one of the games. when the Yankees swept the Braves in '99, the last out, Keith Lockhart of the Braves hit a fly ball to left field that Chad Curtis hit. And the game wasn't close, and the series at that point wasn't close since the Yankees were about to sweep them. And it occurred to me to say, as the ball descended toward Curtis's mitt, the New York Yankees, world champions, team of the decade, most successful franchise of the century, since it was 1999. And every time at Yankee Stadium, during batting practice, when they're showing videos, that clip is shown. Because I guess that was something, there's never any one right thing to say, but that was a good thing to say at that time, because it summarized the season, the decade, that series, and the whole century of Yankee dominance. And another one that comes to mind is David Justice's home run off Arthur Rhodes that clinched Game 6 in 2000 and set the Yankees to the World Series, defeating the Mariners and sending them to the World Series against the Mets.
Bob, I had Jim Leyritz on last week, and he even referenced your call where you can send him on an island basically for 10 months, and you roll him out in October and he hits a home run. So you left your mark even with heroes of the World Series, Bob. So job well done on that.
Thank you. Like every time I see Jim, he's a big horse racing guy. So I used to see him at the Belmont, and every time I see him, he talks about that call, and you just say what occurs to you in the moment, and then you realize afterwards that it means something to people.
We got the great Bob Costas. Bob, you go back to 1995. I've always wanted to ask you this question because you're a baseball lifer, and, you put your heart and soul into sports, broadcasting. And there's butterflies you get, whether it's for me, a certain radio show, for you doing a certain event, the Olympics, World Series. But Mickey Mantle's funeral and the pressure of being able to deliver a eulogy to that extent. Like, Bob, I remember being a kid watching it, and my father, who idolized Mickey Mantle, is hysterically crying. He's in tears. Now I go back and rewatch that funeral, and obviously, you know Yankee history, you know the significance of the Mick. How tough was that for you to prepare for, from like an emotional standpoint, from a broadcasting standpoint? Was that one of the tougher challenges you ever had to deal with throughout your career?
Yeah, I guess so. And yet, I think I knew the subject so well, not just from having been a Mantle fan as a kid, but from knowing Mickey and having had many conversations, private conversations, as well as on-air interviews with Mickey. I kind of knew what I wanted to say, and it just seemed to come together. But I knew I needed some emotional distance from it. So what I did, I finished writing it at about 1 o'clock in the morning, the night before the service. The service was at like 10 or 11 o'clock the next morning. So at 1 a.m. I finish it, and then I read it aloud. I wrote it out in longhand in my hotel room in Dallas, and then I walked around the hotel room and read it out loud to myself 3 or 4 times from start to finish. The reason I did that was to get some emotional distance from it, because as I was writing it, I was getting choked up. And when I read it through the first time, I got choked up. But by reading it several times, I got some distance from it. And I knew it would be emotional enough in the church itself. I didn't want to break down. And my voice choked just a little bit one time. I can't remember exactly where it was, but I was able to get through it. And my main thought was, yeah, these are kind of my thoughts, but they're universal too. Not just for Yankee fans, but so many people said to me afterward, John, I got letters. This is back when people actually wrote letters.
I know, what a concept. What a concept, the letter.
I got more than 5,000 letters. Mostly they came to NBC, and then NBC forwarded them to me. More than 5,000 letters, and many of them said, I grew up in Detroit. I wasn't a Mickey Mantle fan. I was an Al Kaline fan. I grew up in Chicago. I loved Ernie Banks. But anyone from that era understood the feeling you have about the person who was your guy when you were a kid, especially growing up in the 50s and 60s. So I was trying to speak for kids like me who grew up following the Yankees, yeah, and especially Mickey, yeah, but also for baseball fans in general from that era. And I think because I really felt it. It wasn't something I had to express how I felt. It wasn't something where I had to say to myself, what should I be doing here? I knew what I wanted to say because it was genuinely what I felt in my heart. And if I was able to get that across, and the reaction tells me that in some sense I was, then I feel good about it.
Bob, all of these baseball memories, and yet we look at 2020 right now, and there's a whole lot of uncertainty. You were around the game in 1994. Now, Manfred made it clear, 100% yesterday. They're playing baseball. Do you see the eerie parallel 2020 baseball and what happened in 1994, or are we talking apples and oranges?
No, I think there are parallels there, John. Many people said, I'm never coming back. The resentment on the part of fans, not just another work stoppage, because there was a work stoppage every time a new contract came up, but in this case, they lost the World Series. And they lost Tony Gwynn's chance to hit 400. He was at 394 when they stopped. They lost the developing great seasons of a young Cleveland Indians team, and maybe the one best shot that the Montreal Expos would have had to make it to a World Series. A lot was lost there. And in truth, although baseball subsequently came back, attendance was off per game in 1995. Television ratings were off in 1995. But then luckily for baseball, Cal Ripken's night at Camden Yards in 95 helped a lot. And then, even though we view it differently through the rearview mirror, the home run chase of 1998, we now know steroid-fueled, but at that time, it increased interest in baseball, and baseball came back. People want to love baseball. It's generational. It's in their hearts. They want to embrace it, but sometimes the game and the business of baseball makes it difficult. Now, here you have some of those same emotions. Here we go again. The owners and the players fighting once again. But now, it's in the midst of a national and international, actually, pandemic, when everybody in one way or another has had to adjust and take a hit. And there's unrest in the country. And we look to sports to unify us and distract us and give us some moments of uplift and some moments of joy. And here are these people publicly bickering. You know, basketball players have their disputes with the commissioner and with the owners, but they manage to keep a lid on it. In baseball, it's always out in public, day by day, and all this bickering. It's so unseemly. So, if they're unable to get on the field, or if they play only 45 or 50 games, which is why I think Manfred is saying he's 100% sure there will be baseball, because the owners can just cut it down to whatever number they're comfortable with, and then say, okay, here it is. You get your prorated. There it is. We'll pay you prorated for 50 games. So, but if that's the case, and it's kind of a mockery of a season, and fans know that it isn't because of the coronavirus, it isn't because of something outside their control, it isn't because they started in good faith and tried to do everything the right way, and then the virus surged again and they got derailed, it's because of money, then that will increase the resentment all the more. And we know that when 2021 comes around, even if things have settled down, they're going to take an economic hit anyway, because people will have less discretionary income. People will be, at least some of them, slow to feel comfortable coming back to concerts and Broadway shows and sporting events. They're going to take a hit. The industry is going to take a hit. And if that resentment goes into this mix, it's only going to make it worse. And you wonder why both parties can't see that even as they squabble over relatively small things, in the big picture, this squabbling is going to hurt them more than whatever they might gain if they prevail in the negotiations.
Well said. The great Bob Costas. Bob, before we get you out of here, we have something in common. And no, it's not the fact that I ended up staying an extra year at our particular alma mater. I always used to use that with my parents, that if a job comes around my junior year, hey, it worked out well for Costas, they would always remind me, John, you're not Bob Costas. And we know that to be true. So I have to ask, Bob, because you have given back so much to our respective university. I've heard you at the Q&As back when I was a student, which feels like a decade ago because it was. Yeah. When you were back in Syracuse,
Yep.
What is like the go-to for Bob Costas? What needs to be done, whether it's a stop on campus, a restaurant, meeting with a particular group? Like, what does Bob Costas need to do if he's making a trek to Syracuse?
Oh, if I go to Syracuse these days,
That's
because
right.
there's much more in terms of options, shopping and eateries, much more than when I was there in the early 70s. Basically, you ate at the dining hall, or you walked down to Marshall Street and ate at Cosmos Pizza.
Of
which
course,
is gone
yeah.
now. Cosmos has closed, so you could go across the street to the Varsity. And there was a place called Hungry Charlie's down an alley that was like a kind of a burger and sandwich place. And if somebody had a car, and until junior year I didn't have a car, but if you could hop a ride with somebody who had a car, you go down to Erie Boulevard, and there were a string of Italian restaurants there. But these days, if I go back to Syracuse, apart from talking to classes, which I still enjoy doing, I'll usually hook up with Boeheim. And believe it or not, Boeheim can always get a good table at any restaurant he wants in Syracuse.
Oh, stunning. And I say it all the time, Bob, if you can deal with the grilling from Jim Boeheim in a radio interview or at a press conference, these students are well equipped to go cover a big league team. Let's go. You deal with Boeheim and you can handle Boeheim. You can handle anybody.
You know, John, you are 100% right about that, because Jim does not suffer fools gladly. And I think he's actually, at this point, he actually enjoys the sparring with the students and putting them on the spot, because now he can tell himself, I'm really just toughening them up for the profession they hope to pursue.
Bob, this was absolutely incredible. I really appreciate your time. All the best to you and your family. And I hope in a couple of months, my friend, whether it's at the MLB Network in Secaucus or you're out at a stadium, you're back where you belong doing a baseball game, because we miss you, bro.
I hope so too, John. Thank you very much for having me on.
This was tremendous. The great Bob Costas. I mean, as good as it gets in sports broadcasting.